How does one man, behind the controls of a 30-ton steel machine, become the difference between life and death for 9 soldiers stranded in the dark? It is the winter of 1944. The Eastern Front is a nightmare carved in ice and blood. The German Wehrmacht, despite staggering losses, is fighting a brutal rearguard action across the frozen plains of Poland. Soviet forces of the First Belarusian Front are pressing forward, relentless, experienced, and dangerous. Somewhere in the mud and fog south of the Vistula River, a small group of men from the Soviet 8th Guards Army find themselves cut off, exhausted, and surrounded on 3 sides, with a freshly laid German minefield standing between them and survival. What happens next is not the story of an army, a general, or a grand strategic maneuver. It is the story of one man, a tank driver, a junior sergeant whose name history nearly forgot, and the 9 lives he carried through the most terrifying 200 meters any of them had ever faced. To understand what Junior Sergeant Alexei Voronov and his men faced that night, we must understand the world that had produced them. By late autumn of 1944, the Soviet Red Army was a fundamentally different force than the one that had reeled backward in shock in June 1941. 3 years of catastrophic losses, over 8 million soldiers killed, had forged an army of hard, pragmatic veterans. They had learned to fight the German war machine on its own terms, and they were winning. Voronov served in the 12th Guards Tank Brigade, part of the 2nd Guards Tank Corps. At 26, he had already survived Kursk and the brutal fighting along the Dnieper. He had driven T-34s through burning villages, across frozen rivers, and into point-blank artillery fire. He was not a hero in the conventional sense. He was a survivor who had simply refused, again and again, to die. His tank, a T-34-85, the most capable Soviet tank of the war, had been assigned a supporting role during the November push through central Poland. The 85mm gun on the upgraded T-34 could punch through the frontal armor of a German Panzer IV at 1,000 meters. It was a machine built for killing. What it was not built for, what no tank is built for, was navigating a minefield in the middle of the night. The 9 men with him were infantry, riflemen from the 27th Guards Rifle Division. They had been cut off during a German counterattack near the town of Magnuschew, a key bridgehead on the western bank of the Vistula. Their radio had been destroyed, their officer was dead, and the Germans, knowing the Soviets would attempt to withdraw under cover of darkness, had laid a dense minefield across the most direct route back to Soviet lines. The men had 2 options: attempt to go around the minefield, a detour of nearly 4 kilometers through open terrain where German machine gun teams were almost certainly waiting, or go through it. Neither option seemed survivable. By 2100 hours on November 14, 1944, the temperature had dropped to -12 degrees Celsius. A thin, frozen mist hung over the fields east of Magnuschew, reducing visibility to less than 30 meters. The distant rumble of artillery was constant, a reminder that the front was alive, hungry, and close. Voronov's T-34 had taken a grazing hit from an anti-tank round earlier in the afternoon. The right track had been partially damaged, reducing his turning radius and making any sharp maneuver risky. His crew, Loader Corporal Dmitry Shatov, Gunner Sergeant Pavel Morozov, and radio operator Private Gennady Liskov, were all accounted for, all alive. But the tank was not at full capability. The infantry sergeant who approached Voronov's hatch that night was a man named Fyodor Karpov. He was 31, from a village outside Saratov. His hands were shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline and exhaustion. He explained the situation in clipped, urgent sentences. 9 men, 1 minefield, no way around. Voronov climbed out of his hatch and surveyed the field with a field scope. What he saw was deeply unsettling. The minefield was roughly 200 meters wide. German engineers had used a combination of Schuhmine 42 anti-personnel devices and Tellermine 35 anti-tank mines. The Schuhmine, a small wooden box barely detectable by metal detectors, was packed with 200 grams of TNT, enough to blow off a foot or a leg. The Tellermine, a larger circular plate, carried over 5 kilograms of explosive, more than enough to blow the track off a T-34 or to flip a lighter vehicle entirely. There was no visible path through, no gap, no marking, no wire that would indicate a safe lane. But Voronov noticed something. Along the far left edge of the minefield, barely visible in the frozen mist, were 2 stakes driven into the ground roughly 15 meters apart. German engineers often marked the boundaries of their own minefields with such stakes to prevent their own troops from wandering into them. If those stakes marked the edge of the minefield, then the narrow strip just inside them might represent the outermost lane, the margin the engineers had left clear for their own access. It was a theory. It was not a certainty. The strip was no more than 3 meters wide. The T-34's hull was 3 meters wide. There was no margin for error. A deviation of even half a meter to the right would bring the tank's track directly onto a Tellermine, and if the tank was destroyed in the middle of the minefield, if it was thrown sideways or its track blown off, it would block the only potential path and likely detonate secondary mines, killing the infantry sheltering behind it. Voronov's crew said nothing. They had been with him long enough to know when he had made a decision. He climbed back into the driver's seat. By 21:30 hours, the 9 infantrymen had positioned themselves in a single file directly behind the tank, each man gripping the uniform of the man in front of him. The T-34's engine, a 12-cylinder V2 diesel, was throttled to minimum RPM to reduce noise. The tank's headlights remained off. Navigation would be by memory, by instinct, and by the faint outline of those 2 stakes in the dark. Karpov crouched directly behind the tank's rear hull, close enough to touch the exhaust. The heat coming off the engine was the only warmth any of them would feel for the next 20 minutes. Voronov took a slow, measured breath. He eased the tank forward. The first 40 meters were agonizing. Every slight deviation in the frozen ground, every rut, every patch of ice, every subtle slope in the terrain required a micro-adjustment of the steering levers. With the right track damaged, the tank had a persistent tendency to drift 2 to 3 degrees to the right. In open country, this was irrelevant. Here, it was potentially lethal. Voronov compensated constantly, pulling the left lever in tiny, precise increments, keeping the tank's course parallel to the line he had memorized. He could not look out. He could not stop. He could only drive. Behind him, the 9 infantrymen moved in near-perfect silence. Karpov had given a single order before they entered the field. Do not step outside the tank's track marks. Follow exactly where the tank has gone. If the tank has not triggered a mine, the ground beneath its tracks is clear. Step only there. At the 60-meter mark, the tank lurched. The left track had hit a patch of frozen mud that was softer than the surface suggested. For a fraction of a second, the tank slid, perhaps 20 centimeters to the right. Voronov felt it through the controls before his brain fully processed what was happening. He corrected instantly, pulling hard left, straightening the hull. In the darkness behind him, 3 of the infantrymen stumbled. One man, Private Nikolai Ostrov, 19 years old, from Minsk, stepped outside the track marks. His left boot came down 8 centimeters from a shoe mine. He did not know this. He would not learn it until after the war, when Soviet engineers swept the field and documented the mine's position. In that moment, he simply regained his footing and grabbed the shoulder of the man in front of him. The column kept moving. At the 110-meter mark, Voronov lost sight of the stakes entirely. The mist had thickened. He was navigating now from memory and from the feel of the ground, keeping the steering as consistent as possible, trusting that the path he had entered was the path he was still on. This was the most dangerous moment. Fear gripped the men behind the tank. They could hear nothing but the low rumble of the engine and the crunch of frozen earth under the tracks. They could see nothing but the dark shape of the hull in front of them. They had no way of knowing whether the driver was still on course, whether they were walking parallel to a row of teller mines, whether the next step would be their last.
Karpov later recalled that during those minutes he did not pray. He said, "There was nothing to say to God that the driver did not already know."
At the 160-meter mark, Voronov saw the second pair of stakes. He had been navigating blind for 50 meters, but his hands had held the course. The tank had not deviated more than 30 centimeters in either direction. The damaged track, managed with constant micro-corrections, had not caused the catastrophic drift he had feared. He could see the edge of the field now, a low earthen berm, the kind German engineers built to demarcate cleared ground. Beyond it, 40 meters away, was a shallow drainage ditch that led back towards Soviet lines. He did not accelerate. Acceleration meant vibration, and vibration meant the possibility of disturbing ground that had held this long only because of the care taken over every centimeter. He held the throttle steady, kept the corrections minimal, and drove the final 40 meters with the same excruciating patience he had maintained since the beginning. At 21:53 hours, 23 minutes after entering the field, the T-34 crossed the far berm. Voronov brought the tank to a halt. He opened his hatch. In the cold air he could hear, one by one, the sound of 9 men stumbling over the berm behind him. He counted them. 9. All 9. Sergeant Karpov climbed onto the tank's hull and gripped Voronov's hand without speaking. There were no words for what had just happened. The two men held each other's gaze for a moment, and then Voronov said only, "Let's move. The Germans will have heard the engine." They reached Soviet lines at 22:20 hours. In the days that followed, Soviet combat engineers swept the minefield that Voronov had navigated. Their findings confirmed what had been at stake. The path Voronov had selected and held was indeed the engineer's access lane, a strip 2.8 meters wide running along the left margin of the field. To his right, at various points, Tellermine 35s had been placed at intervals of 4 to 6 meters. The closest a tank track had come to a Tellermine was documented at 17 centimeters. 17 centimeters. In the minefield as a whole, engineers recovered and detonated 43 shoe mines and 12 teller mines. Any single one of the teller mines, triggered by the tank's track, would have destroyed the vehicle and almost certainly killed several of the infantry sheltering behind it. The blast radius of a Tellermine 35 in frozen ground could incapacitate a man at 8 meters. Junior Sergeant Alexei Voronov was recommended for the Order of the Red Star by his brigade commander within 48 hours of the incident. The recommendation cited exceptional skill, courage, and presence of mind under extreme combat conditions. Sergeant Fyodor Karpov and the 9 infantrymen submitted a separate written account, which was forwarded to 2nd Guards Tank Corps headquarters. Voronov received the Order of the Red Star on December 3, 1944. He continued to serve with the 12th Guards Tank Brigade through the final push into Germany, surviving the war. He was demobilized in August 1945 and returned to his home city of Voronezh, where he worked as a mechanic for the remainder of his life. He rarely spoke of the war. Of the 9 infantrymen he guided through the minefield, 7 survived the conflict. Karpov was killed in February 1945 during the Vistula-Oder offensive, just 3 months after the night in the minefield. Private Nikolai Ostrov, the young man whose boot had come within 8 centimeters of a shoe mine, survived the war, married in 1947, and raised 3 children in Minsk. He did not learn how close he had come to dying until 1962, when a Soviet military historian published a detailed account of the minefield crossing based on the engineer's post-clearance report. He said, upon reading it, "I always knew the driver saved us. I did not know how completely." This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, America and World War II Stories, and don't forget to press the bell icon as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.